Y'all, y'all, y'all ready for this?
Uh,
Yeah.
uh-huh. Uh, uh.
Hey friends, my name is Elle and this is David, and you are watching the Grow Curriculum Deep Dive for the series Royals, which is from Grow Students Volume 5. What we're going to do in this video is David and I are going to give you like a big picture overview of this series and where it's headed, but then we're going to get really focused on a few specifics from the series that we don't want you to miss because they're really, really cool.
Yes, and so if you are a Grow user, this is for you to give you a head start on preparing for the series, to do this the best you can, to be the most impactful that you can for your students. That you need to prepare for this. And then if you're not a Grow user, no worries. You can keep watching this and you can take the concepts that we're talking about in this deep dive and apply it to your ministry context with the series that you're doing. But specifically for this series, Royals, here's the kind of overview. Here's the structure that we're going to do for the deep dive. So we're going to look at the overview. We're going to do theme of the series. We're going to do the structure of the series, and then finally give you some tips on everything you need to do for the series.
Love it. All right, let's do it.
All right, time to get into our overview section of our deep dive. So Royals is a series all about biblical kings. And so we're going to talk about all different kinds of kings, and we're going to look at the lives of specifically a few. Here are the ones that we're going to look at. We're going to look at Saul just a little bit, but primarily we're going to be looking at David, Absalom, Solomon, and Jesus. And so we're going to talk about all these biblical kings in this because this series is about authority. And we can learn about leadership, both from godly perspectives and not so godly perspectives. And we can learn examples from each of these kings. And we'll hear about that here in our overview.
Yes, I am excited. So the other thing that's like really interesting, I think, about the series is that we're able to give students like a big picture view of like the history of the kings throughout all of Scripture. So that's why we're covering so many different kings because we want to kind of give this big picture like context. So as we do that, we'll kind of help your students see why God never wanted kings to rule Israel in the first place, kind of how all of the king stuff went wrong and went really badly. And then also how Jesus redeemed that whole storyline. And we'll talk about how Jesus is king, like you just said, David, which will be a cool way to kind of wrap up this whole series.
Yes. So in week one, we're going to start off with looking a little bit about David specifically. So we'll touch a little bit about Saul at the beginning, kind of set up some context about the kings and Saul and the lineage of Saul with the kings of David and David. But we'll primarily focus with David and his encounter with Bathsheba and how Nathan calls him out, and then how Uriah is all mixed into this. It's a very messy story, but I think it sets it up well. Because the big idea for week one is when we make mistakes, God can help make things right.
Yes. So we'll kind of start talking repentance, accountability, all that good stuff. Then in week 2, we're going to talk a little bit about like pride and rebellion and some, maybe some ugly things because Absalom is the focus of week 2. So Absalom obviously was never king. He was like a wannabe king. And so with the story of Absalom, we're going to talk about how his arrogance and like his desire for power ultimately led to his downfall. So the big idea there is when you think you know best, be humble instead.
Yes. And then in week 3, we'll talk about how Solomon became king and how he quickly realized he didn't know he needed everything about being a king. And so eventually, even though he did make some mistakes eventually down the road, Solomon did start off on the right foot by asking God for wisdom. And so the big idea for here is when you're not sure who to listen to, ask God for wisdom.
Yes. And then week 4 is the last one in the series. In this one, we're actually going to pivot away from the Old Testament into the New Testament to talk about why Jesus is like the real and best king and why that came as like such a shock to so many people. So specifically, we're going to look at this story of when Jesus predicted his own death. And it's the one where he gets like a little graphic with lots of talk about like eating his flesh and drinking his blood and scared a bunch of people away from following him. So we're going to, rightfully so. It's kind of a weird story if you don't really know what he's doing. So what we're going to do with this week is we're going to really just try to like acknowledge the fact that like sometimes following Jesus can be a little confusing, can be a little difficult sometimes. But when obedience is difficult, the key is to stay close to Jesus.
Yes. And something that's really cool with this series, and it just gives a ton of big picture biblical context. And so we're looking at the lives of these characters. And so we'll do character studies on these kings. And so students will get a really good hands-on kind of learning approach from learning about these characters and their lives and how they can apply to their lives. And so we're also going to be really getting focused that from the lives of these characters that teenagers can really actually deal with. So obviously, all teenagers make mistakes that need to be confronted because of them. They want to be in charge, or they think they know the best. That's a big one for teenagers. They think they know everything. Being unsure of where to go and for solid guidance. Obviously, they're thinking about college. They're thinking about who their friends are going to be, what they're going to eat for lunch. Maybe sometimes is some good guidance as well.
I definitely need advice on that.
Yes,
sometimes.
exactly.
It's hard to decide.
And then the last one we're talking about is the struggling to obey not just human authority figures, but also Jesus as well.
All right, so let's talk about the theme for the series. So since the series is like all about kings, the whole vibe of this whole series is about royalty. So from like the graphics to the games, the room design, music, all of that stuff, it's all about kings and queens and thrones and crowns and like all the royal things that you can possibly think of.
Yes. So let's start off by talking about the room design, because room design and an object lesson really co-align in this series. And so we always give you a room design for every series. And so for this series, this is the room design we suggest. First, you get a big backdrop, and you put the series graphic on there. You can either have it printed or make it yourself if you're artistic. Like if you project an image on there and you can trace it out as well. The line in our graphic is super cool, so make sure you definitely incorporate that somehow. And again, like we always say, we love to see your pictures. So if you take a picture of this, put it on the Facebook group, that'd be fantastic. But here's one of the really cool things about the room design for this particular series. So you're going to get 4 different columns. They're like cardboard columns or just kind of different columns that you can think of. And then you're going to get a fancy pillow and a crown just like this. And so
Wait,
you can
that crown is very small.
It's very small.
So, and that was just the crown of thorns, but there are also regular crowns involved, right?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So we have the Amazon links in there for you to get the crowns. So you can get a couple of those and put those on there. We'll talk a little bit more about how those incorporate with the lesson. But the room design, I think it'd be so cool. Just have the crowns listed there on the columns, and each week you unveil each of them. So that's a really cool thing for you to do.
Yes. Yeah. I love these columns that we found. They're pretty cheap. They're just like made out of cardboard, like you said, David, but we put the links in there for you. So hopefully those are useful to you. And I love the progressive reveal that you're talking about. So talk about that. Tell us about
Yeah. So in every single week, this is just a big thing for you to just prepare ahead of time. Get this, and I think this will just take your teaching to the next level. That each week there's going to be an object lesson that talks about the crown, and so it's essentially just kind of talking about like royalty and like crowns and like what does it mean, what do crowns mean. And so every single week you will actually get to unveil a different crown to kind of represent a different king that we're talking about every single week. So you talk about David, Solomon, and then ultimately Jesus with the crown of thorns at the very end of the week. You get to talk about that. So it's super cool. I think it'll take it to the next level, very engaging and interactive for your students.
Yeah, I love that it does double duty as like the object lesson, but also the room design. And all of the instructions for this are like written out in your curriculum, friend. So we explain it all there. Yeah, all that stuff. You'll be good. It'll be easy.
Exactly. And then the last couple things for our theme to make this come alive even more is that we have given you guys games all based on a royalty theme. So either it's just a play off of words where it's like a normal game, but it's maybe called something different. I think there's one week that's called Game of Coins in there. So you should play that game. I think it's fantastic.
I mean, we're not like telling you to watch the show that the name is based on at all,
exactly.
But if you do like the show, you might like the name of this activity.
Exactly. If you know, you know.
That's right.
And then we got worship songs that all have to deal with Jesus as king or God's kingdom. And then there's also just for fun songs as well that have to deal with royalty that are great, like opening songs or great closing songs as your students come in or out of your space. And they're just fantastic songs.
Okay, so now we want to give you a look at like the structure of the series. So if you've been using Grow for a while, then you know that there are some things that are always the same with our series. So all of our lessons are structured in 3 sections: the what section, so what, and now what. But hopefully you've seen that like every series and sometimes even every week is a little bit different when it comes to the structure. So before you really dive into this, we wanted to give you just a few things to be aware of in terms of the structure of this series so that you can just kind of get a head start and make a little bit more sense of it. So David, what's going on with this series?
Yeah. So for this series, these are some of the things that make it unique for this series. So first off is the object lesson that I was talking about with the crown. Every single week you'll have the object lesson. So that's definitely something very unique for this series. The opening games, like I said, all kind of directly tie into the teaching as well. Some of the games that we listed are standalone just for fun games, but the games in your teaching are actually meant to tie into the teaching time. So like I said, whether it's a play on words of the name of the game, or they're actually really connected to like the teaching about royalty or kings or something like that. And then same thing for the reflections. Every week involves a time of reflections or response where students are invited to write something down that God is showing them.
Yeah. So to do that, to do those reflections, we have some handouts that you'll get in this series. So in week 1, then students are going to be writing down like one wrong that they've done and one thing they can do to make that thing right. In week 2, we're going to ask them to get a little bit honest about their strengths and their weaknesses as we talk about humility. And then in week 3, they're going to be reflecting about who they trust and who they get guidance from. And so those are like the paper handouts that you'll get and that you can print. But week 4 is a little different. So David, tell us about week 4.
Yeah, and so like Elle said, week 4 is a little different. So this week, instead of like having them write on handouts and card cutouts and that sort of thing, order some cutouts, wooden cutouts of crowns. And so they're probably pretty small, no bigger like than your hand or something like that. You'll get students to like maybe write Sharpie on them, but the point of this is that they'll actually write something that they will stay between them and God, and so that's something that they will struggle to obey or believe or trust. And so that's what they'll write down, and they'll get to keep that and kind of keep it as a reminder. And these are just a good way to like just keep the lesson beyond just your teaching time in the youth group, and so that can take it home, reflect on it, and look at it as well. So yeah, that's kind of what the handouts are for.
Love it. So that's kind of the overview, the theme, and the structure of this whole series. But we have just like a few more miscellaneous tips to help you make the most of this. So let's get into that next.
All right, tip number 1, you're going to want to refresh your memory on Old Testament kings. And we've done that for you. So every single week of the series, we have a little section called A Brief History of the Kings. In the first week, it's kind of buried under the first scripture. But essentially, we just kind of give a little bit of a background on who the kings were, what the kings were doing, why the kings started, the relationship between Israel and God. And so that's a really cool way to just do some commentary work that we've done for you. And feel free to use it to teach your students or keep to yourself. Some students may love the history, some students may kind of glaze over it, but it's there for you to use and to teach with. So there you go.
Yes. Love it. Also, week 2, I wanted to point out. So week 2, we're talking about humility. But I really want to emphasize, like, as you're talking about humility with teenagers, it's really important that like we find this balance between reminding them to be humble, but also like not totally shutting them down. The interesting thing I think about like Absalom's story is that yes, Absalom's like rebellion and stuff was a bad move, but it actually started in like a good place because he saw some things about his dad's leadership that was actually a problem that he wanted to like see resolved. So I think it's a really interesting conversation and a balance I think we need to kind of strike when we're talking to teenagers, because they're in this stage of life where like yes, they can be a little bit obnoxious and obstinate and think that they know everything. But that's actually like a really important part of their development. Like that's healthy, that's normal. We need to like coach them to like, hey, you do need to figure out what you think, and you should kind of question authority in healthy ways. But just remember, you don't know everything yet. So really try to find that balance and don't make this a message about like, hey, kids, just sit down and shut up and listen to the people in charge. That is not the message for this week. So keep that in mind.
Yeah. And then the third tip that we have for you is that, like we said at the very beginning, this series is about our biblical kings. And so we are definitely Old Testament heavy on the passages as our primary text, but we also do have a pair of New Testament texts with every week of the series as well. So we just love to give a balanced approach when we do teaching. A lot of these New Testament texts will actually point and kind of be more concrete, that point to the stories of the Old Testament. Sometimes students can get a little bit lost with the characters and just kind of like, sometimes it can be a little bit abstract. And since they're so a little bit older, they just kind of miss the point, even though there are characters and they could relate to the characters. Sometimes we just want to give like a concrete nugget for the students, just to like be like, hey, here's where you can pull off from the story of the characters. And here's something just very solid from the New Testament that they can land on, that sort of thing. So a balanced approach for you to teach.
Love it. Well, friends, that is it. That is what we have for you today for the series Royals in this deep dive. But we're going to be doing this for every single series in Volume 5. So stick around because you'll be getting more of these. David, thank you so much. You're awesome.
Yeah.
And friends, we would love to see what you do with the series. So if you take pictures, if you have like cool stories of how the series has worked really well in your context, would love to hear them. You can post those in our Facebook group, which you can find. It's called Stuff You Can Use, a youth ministry community. And yeah, feel free to drop those ideas, ask questions, whatever you need. we are here to help and support you. So have so much fun with the series. We're super excited about it. Shout out to Isaiah Board who wrote this for us.
Yeah.
What a wonderful time. All right, friends, have a blast teaching Royals. You're awesome. Bye.
Y'all ready for this?